Hi, I'm Mike Lee, author of Our Lost Constitution. I'm tuning in today to wish all Americans a happy Constitution Day. Of the many things that we discuss in our Lost Constitution, I thought it would be appropriate today on Constitution Day to take a minute to talk about Chapter 9 of the book. Chapter 9 talks about the spending power that Congress has. In other words, the power of the purse. In Part 2 of the book, which includes Chapter 9, I explain what citizens can do, what the people can do to restore provisions of our Constitution that have been neglected, or demeaned, or diminished, or lost, as we put it. In Chapter 9, we discuss the fact that one of the ways citizens can do this is by influencing Congress to exercise power that it already has, power that it has under its spending power, under the spending clause of the U.S. Constitution. This power gives Congress the ability to decide what in government gets funded and what doesn't. It's important to remember that as powerful as the President of the United States is, that power is shared, and the President doesn't have any power all by himself to keep his administration funded. The President of the United States has to rely on Congress passing laws that will keep the government funded, that will fund each and every aspect of the federal government, because the President of the United States can't do that alone. One of the most long-standing illustrations of this, that's been around for a long time, is that like so many other places in the Constitution, you have kind of a give and take between the President of the United States and the Congress. On the one hand, the President of the United States is the Commander-in-Chief, for example. On the other hand, Congress has the power to declare war. On the one hand, the President as Commander-in-Chief can make certain decisions with regard to how we're going to use our military, can order specific military strikes. On the other hand, Congress, because Congress has to not only declare war before it's declared, but also fund the entire federal government, including the military, Congress can put limitations on what the President can do in that capacity. All of this is meaningful, and all of this can do an enormous amount of good, precisely to the degree to which Congress decides to actually exercise that power. But it does have to exercise that power in order for it to do any good. James Madison, in the Federalist Papers, described the spending power for this reason as one of the great last protections against government overreach, because ultimately it is Congress which is the branch of the federal government most accountable to the people at most regular intervals. Congress is uniquely empowered to keep the federal government in check. And so that's why Madison explained in the Federalist Papers that through the spending power, Congress can turn the ship when it needs to. Congress can right the ship when it's headed in a dangerous direction. Congress has, in fact, done this on a number of occasions. It has done so under the leadership of both political parties, under presidents and Congresses of every conceivable partisan combination. This has happened a lot. A decade or so after it authorized the Vietnam War through the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, Congress ended the war in Vietnam by withdrawing funds. Similarly, in the 1980s, Congress cut off funding that had once been available for President Reagan's support of the anti-communist Contra rebels fighting the left-wing government in Nicaragua. And as recently as President Obama's first term, Congress reversed course on where to store the nation's nuclear waste. It had previously funded a project to build a spent nuclear fuel disposal facility, a repository in Yucca Mountain, Nevada. But after an onslaught of pressure spearheaded by Nevada's Senator Harry Reid, Democrats succeeded in defunding that program and saying, we don't want to do that anymore. Let's not do that anymore. And so they didn't. In fact, 2 years before President Obama began rewriting Obamacare, his signature legislative accomplishment, one of Obamacare's many provisions, had itself been subject to defunding. As it was originally enacted in 2010, Obamacare created a program to encourage the formation of some nonprofit companies that would sell health insurance. The act appropriated some $6 billion, in fact, for loans and grants for those startups. But in 2011, Congress realized that a lot of this was going to waste, that it wasn't a good program, and Congress defunded the program by $2.2 billion. So this happens all the time. At least historically, it has happened all the time. And again, it's the best way to make sure the American people are still in charge of their government, to make sure that the American people don't become victims of a runaway federal government over which they can have no control. It's also one of the best protections against what some of the founding fathers worried about a lot, with the President of the United States becoming too much like a monarch, because the president could never become too much of a monarch as long as the people's elected representatives, who would be subject to elections every 2 years in case of House members, every 6 years in the case of senators, although senators' terms are staggered so that roughly 1/3 of all senators are up for re-election every single year, that as long as this dynamic remained in force, that the people would remain in control of their government. And even if the president sort of started to skirt the limits of the Constitution or otherwise acted in a manner inconsistent with the wishes of the people, that the Congress could still turn things around and help to protect and restore the Constitution. This is one of the things that came to mind when, in July of 2013, I learned that President Obama had undertaken an effort to essentially rewrite 4 critical aspects of the Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act, Obamacare, his signature legislative accomplishment, that he had undertaken an effort to essentially rewrite initially just 4 provisions of Obamacare, but 4 significant provisions, basically by executive order, through regulatory fiat or some type of executive action or another. This was troubling. Also troubling was the fact that the President of the United States, President Obama, purported to justify these actions by saying, look, Obamacare as written isn't ready to be implemented. And because it's not ready to be implemented, I, the President of the United States, must take this action. I must change the effect of these provisions of the law without going through Congress because, well, that just takes too much time. I'm not sure that Congress would do what I would want to do anyway. And so I raised some concerns. A lot of other people raised concerns. And eventually we undertook a significant effort to say, in effect, if President Obama is saying, this law is not ready to be implemented as written, then Congress needs to go through Congress in order to do that. At the time, a lot of people criticized this. At the time, a lot of people said, look, this law has been passed by Congress, and so they were critical of that. But in doing that, they overlooked something significant, which is that this is the best way. Oftentimes, it's the only way for anyone in the federal government to stop an unconstitutional act by the President of the United States. And so this is something that's very important. This has to happen from time to time. In fact, it ought to happen routinely. Congress ought to decide every single year which programs within the federal government are going to be funded and which ones are not. Unfortunately, that's not always the way it happens. And in fact, many times it's not, because when Congress gets into this pattern of simply funding everything automatically and funding everything in one spending bill each year, then anytime anybody tries to do anything to change anything about how the federal government spends its money, what it does, how it operates, that person is diminished as somehow radical, as somehow wanting to upset the apple cart in a way that's unhelpful. That itself is a very dangerous idea. It is very dangerous to suggest that we shouldn't restrict funding, withhold funding from a federal program that either is harming the people on the one hand, or alternatively that is being used in a way that violates the U.S. Constitution, as was the case in the example I mentioned. And so it's very dangerous when Congress decides to consolidate all of its spending decisions for each year into one single bill. There's no other entity on planet Earth that I'm aware of, certainly no other entity that has anywhere near the amount of money at stake or the number of significant issues that are at stake, as does the government of the United States of America, that operates this way. And sometimes I use this a simple example to explain how absurd it is to operate this way. Imagine if you lived in a very rural area. Imagine you moved to a new rural area way out in the middle of nowhere. There was only one grocery store for hundreds of miles around. And this was the only place you could shop. That's just where you had to buy your groceries. And imagine further that you're on your way home from work one day, and as you're leaving work, you got a phone call or a text message from your spouse saying, don't come home without bread, milk, and eggs. Stop at the store, buy bread, milk, and eggs. We don't need anything else, just those three items, bread, milk, and eggs. So you go to the grocery store to buy bread, milk, and eggs on your way home from work. You go into the grocery store, you get out your cart, you get the bread, you get the milk, you get the eggs, you put them in your cart. You go to the checkout counter, you put down your bread, your milk, and your eggs, and you say, I'd like to buy these three items. The cashier starts ringing you up. And as the cashier finishes this process, the cashier says to you, I'm sorry, you can't buy any of these things. You can't buy any of these things unless you also buy a half-ton of iron ore, a bucket of nails, a book about cowboy poetry, and a Barry Manilow album. And in fact, now that I'm thinking about it, you can't buy any of these items, even bread, milk, and eggs, without buying one of every item in the entire store. Now, this would be horrible. It would be especially horrible if this were the only store where you could shop for many hundreds of miles around. You'd end up being held hostage. You'd end up being basically extorted into buying all kinds of things you didn't want to buy, that your family didn't need and perhaps couldn't afford. Well, this, in many respects, is like what Congress does every single year, especially when it consolidates all the spending decisions. We're talking about a federal government that spends between $3.5 and $4 trillion every single year. When you consolidate all of those spending decisions into one simple vote, and members of Congress are told this is, in many instances, the votes on this come up at the very last minute, perhaps with only days or hours, in some cases even minutes to go before the current spending bill expires, then they're told, I'm sorry, there's no opportunity for you to discuss or debate aspects of this spending measure, no opportunity to propose and either pass or reject amendments to this legislation. You can imagine how frustrating that is. And even more importantly, you can imagine how perilous this is when this is the best check that we have against unconstitutional overreach by the executive and within the federal government. That process, that important constitutional check, is thwarted by this process of spending through what are sometimes called continuing resolutions, which are basically a reset button, where you just continue all of the current spending levels, or alternatively through what's called an omnibus spending package, which is a big, long, sometimes hundreds or even thousands of pages long spending bill that will allocate spending for that year. Either way, when members of Congress are being told this is a take it or leave it package, and you've only got this binary choice, either yes or no, either on or off. In that moment, when you operate government that way, as we have been operating government for the last few years, the Constitution suffers and the people suffer. We are less able to restrict and constrain the power of the President of the United States and less able to respond to unconstitutional overreach. It's important to remember in this context that sometimes when people see the President of the United States take an unconstitutional action, let's say he's rewriting a law, whether it's Obamacare or otherwise, he doesn't have the power to do so. Sometimes people, in response to the suggestion that maybe we ought to use the spending power to correct that or some other abuse within government, sometimes they'll say, well, let's just take him to court. Let's just let the courts do that. After all, if it's unconstitutional, the courts will take care of it, right? Well, that's not always that simple. In fact, usually it's not. There are many instances, countless instances, in fact, in which a constitutional problem either can't be, in some cases, or in other cases, won't be remedied by the courts. Sometimes it's because the court's jurisdictional rules won't allow a certain type of challenge. Sometimes it's because the President of the United States is often immune from suit. So if he himself is being sued, that can be a problem. Other times it's because the courts aren't well equipped to handle these kinds of things, and you have a lot of jurisdictional rules that require certain conditions to be met before you can bring suit. In other cases, it might just be because the courts are very leery about stepping into an interbranch battle in many cases between these two political branches, the legislative branch, Congress, and the executive branch, headed by the President of the United States. So that's why Congress has to be counted on as a defender of the Constitution. You shouldn't allow members of Congress, shouldn't allow Congress as an institution, or others to say, look, if there is a constitutional defect, surely the courts will deal with it, because most of the time that's just not true. And even where it is true, even where it can happen, even where the courts will sometimes step in and remedy a constitutional overstep by the President of the United States, as happened about a year and a half after the President of the United States, President Obama, made 4 unconstitutional recess appointments on January 4, 2012. Finally, about a year and a half later, the Supreme Court of the United States stepped in and said that's unconstitutional. That is the exception, not the norm. And even there, where ultimately the Supreme Court did the right thing and stepped in, there was a lot of damage done, a lot of damage that couldn't really be undone by the time the Supreme Court stepped in. That's why it's so important for Congress to do its job. That's why it's so important for members of Congress to remember that they've all taken an oath to uphold, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States. And I think that includes the duty to try to withhold funds from a government program that's being implemented in an unconstitutional manner. With that, I hope all of you have a very happy Constitution Day. If you've enjoyed what you've heard today, and if you haven't picked up a copy of our Lost Constitution, I'd encourage you to do so. You can check it out from a library. You can borrow it from a friend. If worse comes to worse, you can even find it on Amazon electronically in paperback form, audiobook, or hardcover. Also, if you like what you're hearing here, please like the Facebook page, Our Lost Constitution. It's great to like this post, but also like this particular Facebook page because that'll make it easier for me to make sure that you see more of these Facebook Live videos. Thank you very much. Happy Constitution Day, and may God bless the United States of America.